I mean, I have huge respect for your central banker. And I don't think he'll let inflation get out of control. So if he has to slow the economy down or contribute to it to get it done, he will. Now, he'll be sensible about it because with commodity price volatility and an economy trying to change relative prices, it's very difficult to do that in a low inflation environment. That's part of the problem we have in Europe, right? You know, if you have downward inflexibility in prices, then you can make relative price changes much faster in a medium, stable inflationary environment. So I think stable at 5 and 6%, even though the pundits say you ought to be at not you, but I mean in general, the advanced countries say 2, and you know, smart people that are smarter than me, like Paul Romer, say why 2? You know, and so I think that's part of the answer, and the other part may be, and this is speculative, some of these trade-offs come from the exposure you have when your capital account's relatively open. And I think a rethink of in what respect it should be open to reduce the vulnerabilities is, without presuming to tell you what the conclusions are, but you will have noticed that the turbulence caused by the tapering announcement was pretty broad and had nothing to do with China. Nothing. Okay? And one of the reasons is they got a lot of ammunition to stabilize exchange rates and other stuff called reserves. There are actually 3.5 trillion of them, I think. But the other one is the capital account isn't really open. Now, there's lots of costs of having a non-open capital account, and it is a pretty underdeveloped financial sector that will not support the growth model in the future. So maybe, you know, in another 5 years, they're going to have the same configuration everybody else has and have to deal with the exposure to, you know, capital flows in a kind of distorted global environment. But for now, I think it's a kind of short-run, kind of pragmatic, putting the pieces together problem rather than a real threat to growth. The long-run drivers of growth are the human capital base of the economy, its ability to go after the opportunities as they present themselves. So can I say one last thing? Last night we were talking about this, and I think that the most important thing you can have in an economy is a structure and a set of people that take advantage of opportunities, not all of which you can predict. And that's different from having a growth model. That's having intangible assets in the political system, in the business system, in the financial system, in all kinds of places, so that as this world changes around us very fast, you know, you're faster than most at getting at the opportunities. And I kind of think India is one of those places, frankly. I mean, I'm sure of it on the human capital front, so that's why everybody keeps coming here. Yeah.
I think Montek has a question.
Mike, that was a fascinating lecture, and I'm going to spend some time still absorbing bits of it. But there's one question. It doesn't necessarily come directly out of your lecture, but it does respond to a point you made that, you know, maybe we're a bit short of global demand. And how do we handle that problem? Now, you know, in the G20, our Prime Minister very early on was saying, and has been saying, that given the shortage of global demand, what's the best kind of demand to inject into the system?
Right.
Particularly from the point of view of developing countries. Somebody mentioned Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and so on.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, you mentioned that, for example, in China, it should be consumption. I agree with that. They shouldn't be doing investment. It seems to be that the most important thing for the whole developing world, other than China, is investment in infrastructure. Right. Infrastructure in the sense that infrastructure is sort of obvious. What to invest in terms of products is something that markets should decide.
Yeah.
And here, the real question is, globally, are we willing to recognize that financial markets by themselves won't finance it? Now, if we were taking a purist efficient markets hypothesis kind of view, then of course one would reject all this and say, no, you better get your policies right and the world will do the rest. But you know, if you look what's happened in Europe, and in the US, the main thing is a highly innovative, aggressive, throw the book out, don't assume the financial market will stabilize, be active. That's what Bernanke did, that's what Mario Draghi did, and you just said that Angela Merkel actually encouraged him against the view of her own central banker. So is there any chance of the global community taking a remotely comparable initiative in recognizing that we need more infrastructure investment in the developing world? Doesn't have to be all public sector driven. Actually, all of them are now doing one kind or the other of PPP. Yep. But the international financial institutions have to step in and do something innovative. Now, this has been talked about in the G20 for the last 3 years with absolutely no forward movement whatsoever. Comment.
I think it's probably, so I agree with everything you said. It's the single biggest opportunity. Regardless of how you estimate the shortfall in aggregate demand, there is a massive pool of savings sitting around locked up, not knowing what to do with itself, and a huge investment program that's part of the, what I call a convergence process. All these cities, everything. So now the question is, how do we get at it? And I don't have a complete answer, so let me give you some observations. One, I don't think the G20 will do it, but it might get around to insert priority setting something that's relevant. It might go to the World Bank or an expanded entity and say, look, somebody has to be the architect of this and sort of, put together a plan which has the pieces in it. What are the pieces? Well, some of the pieces might be investment treaties. Some of the pieces might be harmonization of resolution mechanisms when there are disputes. I've been told recently that one of the reasons there's excessive use of debt in many developing countries is that you can resolve disputes over debt in multiple legal jurisdictions, whereas equity disputes are always reserved locally, and the external investor is always nervous that that will be a biased or unfriendly environment for the resolution of that. I cite these only to suggest that if we could, I'm not sure the current World Bank is going to, set up and kind of with a target to do this, although they obviously have one of these horizontal infrastructure groups that's about to be populated as part of the reorganization. But I guess what I think, Montek, is there's enough issues like that we need, the G20 needs to explicitly sort of assign somebody the job of putting the whole thing together, or encouraging it, or say, yes, let's have a bunch of regional integratable investment treaties that solve some of these problems. We have this kind of fragmentation in the trade world, so it's hard to believe we won't have fragmentation in the investment world, with respect to treaties and negotiations. But anyway, piecing that together with embedded in it, and this is a big opportunity between the United States and China. It's being discussed explicitly. The Chinese have this, I don't think they want to hold treasury bonds and agencies forever. So if the Fed can get it together and the government, the treasury, to finance themselves somehow sensibly with reasonable interest rates, the Chinese, without doing damage, can diversify into higher return investments. And one of those, if we structure it right, might be infrastructure here, infrastructure in America, infrastructure they're already in Africa. Maybe we should go look at what's going on. I know there's some potential problems with that. But bottom line is, I think when you're looking around for how much good you could do, this is probably on a very short list of the best things. Yeah.
Well, Mike, you can see, I still see hands coming up. You...
Not hungry yet?
Yeah?
Keep going.
Yes, please.
I'm Barun Mitra. I have a question, particularly because you have your writings on convergence. How do you look at Euro in hindsight? Was it a good idea, or was it an attempt at forced convergence that really not working out.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'll come to you.
I'm Sunil Chako. I'm a graduate of the Columbia Business School, very close to your building. My question is about resilience. You spoke about resilience and the informal economy. Excluding the subsistence economy, just taking the undeclared cash transactions that are not criminal but may attract civil penalties, to what extent are they being included in the models, the growth models? That's the first question. And briefly, the second one, that from time to time, people have spoken about green accounting, environmental related points to be included in financial statements of companies. What progress has been achieved and how might that be advanced? Thank you.
Dr. Rajiv Lall.
Yeah. I was trying to apply your framework to the Indian context, and suggest that we are arguably entering a phase where, for a variety of reasons, in our growth model, we are at the risk of underinvesting. And that's a lot to do with political economy kind of factors that are playing. And it has a lot to do with actually the robust nature of our democracy that requires, in our growth process, a very substantial share of income going to labor, shall we say, as opposed to capital. In the US, I was struck by your graph, which shows a very sharply declining share of labor income in GDP. Raghu has actually argued that the US was able to get away with it because of its ability to borrow from the rest of the world. So the poorer households were allowed to borrow beyond their means, and although their share of income was declining, you were able to maintain a high growth. So my question is, if this is the politics of the country, that the balanced growth model for us will, relative to China certainly, have a lower equilibrium sustainable rate of investment, and therefore our sustainable growth rate must necessarily be lower. Your comment? Or
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Firstly, I would like to congratulate you on an excellent lecture. And I'm Dr. Garima Malik. I'm an assistant professor in Delhi University. My question is that even though India has had high growth rates in the pre-2008 recession, and so has China, but in terms of health indicators, in terms of education indicators, in terms of even social security, China is way ahead of us. So what are the lessons that we can learn, if any? And because we have extreme poverty, and like someone talked about inflation, and those are the key concerns for the people in the the lower segment. So what are the policies for for poverty alleviation? So is it just growth? Is that it's necessary, but is it sufficient? That's my question.
Okay, we have two more, and then we will get back to the speaker.
Yeah, good question.
Oh, we have three more.
Professor Spence,
Make this one easy.
there are many takeaways. My name is Ravi Chaudhary, Senior Consultant. There are many takeaways of your talk, but I want to refer to four of them to point to a question. Aggregate demand is lower than aggregate supply in the world. Tradable goods increase will not create more jobs. In any case, the international trade is coming down. It's becoming lower than GDP for the second year in a row. Third,
In terms of growth, right? Yeah, right. Yeah.
the
that's
new
right.
jobs created are far less than the new jobs required all over the world as a result of growth in populations.
Yep.
And how do we see consumption coming up. Are we going to live in a perennial unemployed society hereafter? I think the sustainable model, you didn't talk about it, would like to throw some light on it, sir, in a global context.
Thank you. Good question. At the back. Mm-hmm.
There was a debate on the economy policy going on between two eminent economists, Amartya Sen and Jagdish Bhagat. So, I mean, the question on that, I mean, which model would you...
It's Amartya and who? Abhijit? Oh, Jagdish. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Okay.
so,
Yeah, right.
They were debating on the growth versus redistribution model.
Yeah.
So basically, I mean, just a view on what model do you watch for, and I mean, which model is preferable over here.
Yeah. The next person.
My name is Sanjay. I am from National Labour Institute. I would like to know from you, your suggestions, how can we address the concerns of labour in coming decade? How can we address the concerns of labour in the coming decade?
The concerns of labor.
Concerns of labour in the developing nations.
Thank you. I think with that now we get Mike to respond and then we close. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks. Thanks, Isha. Okay. The euro. Was it a good idea? The people who did it weren't fools. They knew it had to be followed by fiscal and ultimately political union, and the external commentary was the same. The misestimate, I don't know whether to call it a mistake, was how great the resistance to that would be. And they certainly didn't anticipate the imbalances that I kind of showed you that came from the introduction of the euro. So with the benefit of hindsight, I mean, we talked about this in the Growth Commission. Some industrial policies don't work, and then you abandon them because they cost too much and they're not doing any good. With the benefit of hindsight, it's a mistake. Was it a mistake at the start? It's kind of a philosophical question. But I will tell you, the Eurozone has a flawed structure, because everything I know about growth suggests that it depends on a fairly long list of public sector behavior, tax systems, investments, and so on. Infrastructure, human capital, openness, the knowledge and technology base of the economy. There's a kind of view in Europe that we'll get this all together if we have enough fiscal consolidation, or centralization, or discipline, or some version of that. And I think that's wrong. I mean, if you look at what is centralized and decentralized in Europe, everything that affects growth, practically, is decentralized, except the monetary system. And so I think they're going to have to go one way or another. They're going to have a more forceful system that limits divergence of that kind, which mainly means union. Or they're going to have better adjustment mechanisms. But to be honest with you, we're just getting through the mess right now, and we're not there's a lot of smart people talking about it, but there's no real resolution. But even when the convergence occurs and it's a kind of stable economic situation, the structure is flawed. And I have to tell you, living there, I don't think citizens of a whole variety of countries are prepared to decide they're really citizens of Europe at this stage. It'll probably, if it happens, it's a couple of generations away. And how we get from here to there, I don't know. The informal economy and green accounting. The informal economy, I guess, is important. What is very important to a lot of people. And in lots of countries, the formal economy is structured in such a way to serve the incumbents and not the other folks, and that's a problem. The most extreme case of it I've ever seen is South Africa, where the unions basically defend the incumbents, and there's several tens of millions of people who aren't incumbents for historical reasons, who basically don't have any way to get into the modern economy. And that's a hard problem to solve, because the incumbents and their institutional representatives are very powerful. Having said that, the one thing I think that can be problematic is if any external foreign direct investor has to enter via the formal economy, whereas what's really working and flexible is mostly the informal economy. I don't mean the subsistence, I mean the informal. Then that's a barrier to foreign direct investment of certain kinds, right? If it has to enter through that route. And that's a policy challenge that probably should be undertaken. And green accounting is making major progress at multiple levels. I mean, I actually think what is called ESG, which is environment, social governance, is spreading pretty rapidly in the investment community and the corporate community. I wouldn't say, you know, it's a tipping point yet, but I'm kind of impressed. And I think there's real progress from the World Bank, and our colleague Mahmoud Mohiuddin is leading this effort in generating not only a dashboard that's a better way to look at how an economy is performing that has distributional and sustainability measures in it, but actually gets countries to start, and companies and others to start supplying the data so you can actually see it as opposed to conceptualize it. And I definitely think it's the right way to go. You know, under the kind of, if you don't measure it, then it's easy not to pay attention to it, kind of. So I think there's real progress there. You know, so if an economy has priorities other than growth, and if those priorities are sufficiently important, and there's no other way to fund the investment, then it's not the worst thing in the world. You've got to slow down a bit, right? If investment is one of the growth drivers, that's okay, I think. That's just the way it is. I mean, that priorities are priorities. And, you know, if it takes a little longer to get from A to B, you know, nobody said 7% was okay and 5 is a disaster. I mean, it really depends on, at least in democracies, on choices people make. So the other option, of course, is for periods of time, done properly, is external investment, you know, where there's big pools of savings that are looking for a good place to invest. And I think that everybody here is well aware of that. So that's a constraint relaxing measure, and what you do is you create an investment environment that, as the economy opens up at a measured pace, creates increasing sets of investment opportunities, whether it's infrastructure or in the financial sector or in logistics and retail and whatnot. I mean, I'm well aware you don't do this overnight. You can blow parts of an economy away. So it still takes judgment, but that's a real option, I think. You can go that route. Growth. Is it necessary? Yeah, it is necessary, and you're right. It's not sufficient. So both things are true, but I think, I mean, with respect to the China, you know, comparison, the way I do the China comparison is not China now versus India now, but China back, you know, maybe somewhere around 12 years ago when its per capita income was about like India's. Or you can project yourself forward and say, what is it going to look like here when our per capita income is $6,500, and it's not going to take forever to get there. I think that's the fair comparison. And once you get to that level, you can afford more stuff, and you have less difficult trade-offs between these distributional issues and whatnot. I mean, in the early stages, China made a set of choices very few countries made, partly because it's not democratic, so they said we're going to grow. They made a set of generational choices that were pretty draconian. If you're investing 40% of GDP when your per capita income is $400, you're consuming at the rate of, I don't know, what is it, 200 and some odd? I mean, I'm not sure every society either could or would want to do that. But so we're all different. But that was a centralized decision. The government of China, after the Communist Revolution, controlled the assets. So they could make those decisions, and they made the ones they wanted. I have 3 more, and I'll do it real fast. How to create employment and demand. I think this is the major challenge of our day, and I don't think anybody has an answer for it. So I think you can, and they're related for the reasons you mentioned, right? And that is, if it's true that people with lots of capital and very high incomes don't save at a higher rate, I'm not sure that's generally true, but I can certainly see why. We don't have good data on this, right? Then you can strip out the demand, and then it's also true that, you know, you got a problem unless you generate it somewhere else, right? And you may not be, and you may have an adding up problem. But I think the real challenge, setting that aside, isn't really the demand problem. It's the employment challenge in many, many places. And by employment, I mean employment and distribution, or quality of work, or something like that. And there are some obvious things to do. One is any deficit whatsoever in human capital acquisition, whether it's at the household or individual level or at the state level, is a big mistake if you can fix it. Because if there's one thing that's clear, is that the entire global economy is pushing all of us up the value-added spectrum. That's what people do now, for the most part. So that's one. The second one is, you know, countries make very different choices with respect to burden sharing in transitions. You have a big negative demand shock. Now go around the Nordic countries and Germany and Europe and America and just take a look at the configuration. In America, the burden is almost entirely borne by the unemployed or the people who gave up. In Germany, there's a huge amount, and this is true in many of the Nordics, there's a huge amount of sort of, you know, it's not part-time work, it's everybody cuts back, but they're still employed. If you take seriously it's worse than detrimental, it's a brush fire, effect of long-term unemployment on young people in terms of eventual employability, then the German model starts to look, you know, pretty sensible. Now, you can go quacking away about whether it's efficient or not, but it's sort of irrelevant, you know, if you're talking about losing half a generation. I don't know if you know what the unemployment rates are, but, I mean, in Spain it would be 50% for young people, even if you tone it down a bit because it's not quite right. So let's say 40. In Italy, it's probably 30, maybe a bit higher. I mean, anyway, you see what I mean. The enemy of doing something sensible of this is market fundamentalism. It's the belief that markets are not only useful tools for resource allocation, but there's something, you know, religiously right about the outcomes. That's a disastrous point of view. And fortunately, it's not too widespread, but it's widespread enough to be causing problems. Jagdish versus Amartya, geez. Amartya's certainly right in this respect, that attaching a high weight to distributional issues as part of a growth strategy is, I can't believe that the Growth Commission was unanimous on that point. Is that fair, Montek? Now, how you implement that is there are better and worse ways to implement it. I mean, if you look at the Nordic countries, you know, you find the most interesting experiments in social security systems, I think, in the world today. Because what they're really, and Germany is in this business too, what they're really trying to do is find ways to protect people that are oriented toward the dynamism of the economy. So unemployment is very focused on skills, training, and upgrading, and re-entry in the job market, and so on. So, but it's still inclusiveness, right? That's the value that's driving this, as opposed to, you know, let the markets do what they want. Now, I don't know, I honestly don't know where Jagdish is on this. I mean, he believes, I think, and has been one of the great defenders of an open global economy. It's hard to argue with that. And I don't think Amartya would say that you should pursue equity to the exclusion of growth at all. I mean, I've never heard him say it. So I'm not sure there's a real conflict. The last question had to do with concerns of labor in, what was the rest of it? Last question. Huh?
How do we address the concern
Of labor.
in developing countries?
Yeah, you know, growth.
On that note, may I invite Dr. Kathuria to propose a vote of thanks?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think this has been most fascinating, and it brings the curtain down on the 5th K.B. Lall Memorial Lecture, which I think has been one of the most successful ones that we have organized, both in terms of content as well as in terms